What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Friday stream here on ADSR. My name is Taetro. If you don't know me, I'm a live electronic music performer, beat maker, producer, content creator. I'm here every Friday on the ADSR channel. So thank you for joining us today for some production concepts, a new idea for these Friday streams. Usually we're starting from scratch, making some music, checking out a plugin, checking out a new sample pack. Today we're going to dive into a very specific production concept, and that is arranging and creative techniques for arranging. And I guess I'll go through my sort of philosophy around creating arrangements and actually finishing tracks. I feel like a lot of people get caught up in making just tight little loops, awesome sounding music, but they never get it out on the timeline, or they get stuck trying to arrange it across the timeline and coming up with interesting ways to use the musical ideas and also build on them after you come up with that initial loop. You know how it goes. What's going on, everybody in chat? Thank you for joining us today. Nice to see you all. James Murley, David Bora, Drunk Bishop, hello. Stephen Dixon, Tiny Bites, Army of One. My dad's in the chat. Swift Dreamer. Ed Oyamo, what's up, my friends? Thank you all. Drunk Bishop says, dang, been so long since I've seen Taetro. Yes, hopefully you can see my tan a little bit. I've just kind of been out and about at some national parks and doing some stuff, but you know. Yes, so I'm excited for today's thing. Instead of starting with a blank project day, we're actually going to be starting with a finished project, which is an interesting concept and just a different approach. So I think this will be fun. As usual, make sure you subscribe to the channel with notifications on, because I'm not the only streamer today here on this channel. There's multiple streamers throughout the week doing different production concepts, doing synthesis, sound design, all kinds of awesome music making happening here on the ADSR channel. So make sure you're subscribed with the notifications on. We've also got the sample challenge coming up on Wednesday. We do that every week. If you're a part of our Discord community, amazing, you should enter. If you're not yet, use the link in the description and join the Discord. I'll be returning this Wednesday as the host of that show as well. So I know you all had a lot of fun with Alina doing the challenge the last couple weeks, but I'll be back. So yes, what's up? Welcome back from Big Bear. Yeah, I was in Big Bear a couple of weeks ago. This trip was to a couple different places though. I spy a micro freak, says Swift Dreamer. Yep, that's true. All right, so I think this is going to be a fun stream today. Like I said, we're going to be starting with finished projects today rather than empty projects. I'm going to show two project files today. One is for more of a lo-fi chill beat. Actually, it's the beat that just came out earlier this week called Daydream. So it's completely finished because this is a release track. And that's a more mellow tune, more simple arrangement there. And then we're going to move on and do one of my, I guess it's more of a banger. Like one of my more like contemporary like pop tunes. It doesn't have vocals on it or anything, but it's a more electronic, heavier track. So we'll do both of those and go through them all. But yeah, as usual, if you have questions or if you want to just like ask anything around this topic of arrangement, please leave it in the chat and I'll be sure to respond as best that I can. Kyle Gray Young, what's going on? William C. Beckham, nice to see you. We're up and over on Facebook for those that don't know me. Yeah, of course. I don't see any chat coming up from Facebook or Twitch. Maybe that's me. But hey, welcome. Thank you for being here. So here we are in Ableton Live, my job choice. I think one of the biggest breakthroughs for me lately has been working exclusively in arrangement view. This linear, we see time at the bottom, right? This linear view of Ableton Live. Previously, I was very strictly working in session view, which I just hit tab. And, you know, I would build up certain loops and stuff within session view. Get these clips here. And then I would bring them over to arrangement. But what I found is when I just started working in arrangement view, I was just quicker to get to a finished product, quicker to get to a finished arrangement. I'm going to go ahead and pause the background music. So as we go through today, I want to just talk through the sections of some of this track, and I guess I'll hit play on it for now, and we'll just give it a listen in the background as we go. Arthur Rios says a K-pop track. The next track we'll do is actually like more of a K-pop inspired track for sure. It's going well, Kyle Grayon. Thank you for asking. So yeah, this is my track that came out this week called Daydream. So this is kind of your typical lo-fi and chill beat. And I approach arrangement of this type of beat relatively simply. So you can kind of get the vibe here. And one thing I'll say is probably just like a lot of you, my tracks don't start, like we don't compose for the most part with like, okay, let's compose the intro, then let's compose this A section, then let's compose the hook. Like we don't compose in a linear way like that. Usually what we often start with is like a simple 4-bar loop that we build up, and that's exactly what I do. So for instance, this loop here, I don't need to turn those on, is pretty much the core of the track. So just identify the core elements here. We've got the piano. That's playing the chords. That's the first loop that I came up with for this track. We've got the piano melody on top. Some bells, and of course the drums. Don't forget the bass line. Those are the core musical elements here. Very, very simple, right? But then how do we take that 4-bar thing and expand it out and build on it, right? That is the mystery we're trying to solve today. And let's work backwards. Let's look at just the first 16 seconds of the track. Not 16 seconds, 16 bars, which by the way, this track really starts at, bar 5-ish. And intros are very important, and they're the first thing that the listener hears, but ironically, they're usually one of the last things that I end up building. So for a track like this, what is an intro? Well, for much lo-fi, you probably hear field recordings, which is one that we have here. Let me actually unsolo all these tracks so we can hear everything. So we've got birds. Like, by the way, I've got this pack from the ADSR store, sample packs, Black Octopus, ambient field recordings, Black Octopus sound. Like I've been diving into this a lot. It's just different combinations of nice outdoor sounds. These are perfect for like intros and outros. I just love setting the mood with a nice field recording. So I've highlighted this section here, and we're gonna call this, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 bars. We'll call it 4 bars with a little extra on top, just to keep things simple. A little fade in, set up our track, and let's actually label these sections as we go, right? I can add locators on the timeline here, and we can call this intro. Very simple, right? Builds up the mood of the track. You have birds chirping, you have piano, and then you have a transitional sound, which we will talk more about later. These are very, very important when it comes to arrangement. These transitional sounds, the FX, something I also do later in the arrangement phase. Now remember, we started with a core loop. We're pretending like, hey, we started and we already came up with drums, bass, piano, and melody. But we got to get there. We don't want to give everything to the listener right away. So we're constantly building and building. So that first 4 bars is the intro. And I have a more of a songwriting background, more of like a typical contemporary like pop music kind of background, and that's what I'm interested in. So I talk about things in terms of these normal sections, right? So we'll have intro, and then we've got a solid drum beat come in, a back beat, right? Kick and snare. We also have the bass come in as well. Important to also note that the intro piano is an octave higher than the verse piano. So when you're coming up with your core ideas, it's not always about coming up with a brand new musical idea, but how can you shift and change the musical ideas that you already have to fit different sections. So for instance, I do this a lot. I'll take one musical idea, and for certain sections, it will be up an octave, like right here. Let's just change this a different color, make it yellow. And we see that that's also happening over here. So for specific sections, we take the exact same musical idea and we bring it up an octave. We'll see that throughout. So labeling this section here, we'll call this verse 1. And that's just kind of a simplified version, unsolo. And then as we get to the next 4 bars, we just kind of build on top of that. We add a melody and we add some shakers, which adds some more motion. Now, nothing really fundamentally changed. We just kind of added on top of the core, piano and bass and backbeat. So this is not really a new section. I would just call this like, what do we call this? Like verse 1A or something. Rename. We just kind of added to it. It's a build. I see a question in the chat. Do you have any tips to help distinguish a focal point in your tracks? Would you say that's related to arrangement? I think that is related to arrangement, because arrangement, we're not just thinking about the timeline, like going forward on the timeline. We're also thinking about like how many things are playing at once and what is the listener supposed to be listening to. And another thing you'll start to notice as we look at this arrangement is about every 4 bars, something will change. We'll either be adding something or taking away. So obviously for this section of 4 bars, the focal point is this top melody that's not only played on the piano, it's also played on this bells instrument. Very faint, but it is adding to the initial piano. So if you want to bring something to attention, like if there's something that the listener is supposed to be paying attention to, first of all, let's get anything else out of the way that doesn't need to be there. There's no other really melodies in this register happening. There's the lower piano, and it's very simple. And then the bass line is the rock solid foundation, and the drums are the drums. So there's nothing to get in the way of this melody. But not only that, it's doubled on 2 instruments. So that is the very clear focal point of this section, that melody. And we'll see how this kind of evolves over time as we add more layers. Okay, so once we get to bar 17, what happens? So, it's not always about adding things. Sometimes it's about taking things away and changing the sounds that you already have. So for instance, the drums went through a major change for this bar 17. And I would almost call this like this is not a hook. I would definitely call this like a pre-chorus, even though it doesn't really make sense in the context of this track. But I call it a pre-chorus because it's not a hook. It's not a chorus. It's not a verse. We lose momentum a little bit. We lose drums, which kind of has us like waiting for the next drop. So, but like I said, the drums went through a major change here. We lost a kick. There's no more kick here. However, you'll notice that there is a kick on the downbeat. Oftentimes when we're working in loop-based music, we work in, a solid 4 to 8 bars, right? So it would have been really easy for this kick to just not exist. But then that kind of kick becomes just awkward. Like, why is it even there? It is nice to have phrases finish on a downbeat, especially with a kick, like have that kick play on that final downbeat, right? And like I said, there's no musical content getting added here. The initial piano melody evolves and is different than it was 4 bars ago, but it's still the focal point. We're still listening. We took away the kick, and we also changed the sound of the snare, or the sound that's on the 2 and 4, right? So for instance, like using automation, right? Changing sounds rather than adding new ideas, new sounds. The less complicated we can get our tracks, the more cohesive for the listener, I think. Sometimes we overcomplicate things because we think that that's advanced, but it's not necessarily. So some automation that you'll see here for the snare sound, which normally sounds like this. Pretty dry, like a stick sound, right? Hello, Mr. G. Smith. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so that was for the main verse, right? But then we get to this pre-chorus section. We hear that the sound is changed. It's gotten further away. I've lowered the pitch here. And I've also automated the return reverb so that it's getting a lot more reverb. There's a lot more space. If I hit A for automation, you'll see that this automation line is turned all the way up just for this section. And you'll see that that happens again later in the hook, but we'll get to that in a moment. So again, we're creating a sort of tension and release, not by adding new things, but by taking some things away. We go from verse 1A to our pre-chorus. Now, sometimes in modern songs, you have a pre-chorus that leads right to a chorus, or sometimes it's kind of this false anticipation and it leads back into a verse, a second verse. And I would say that's what's happening in this track. So we just repeated that pre-chorus. And here at bar 21, I would call this verse 2. Now, it's very obvious what changed. What makes this different than verse 1? We're going to call this verse 2, but if it was exactly the same as verse 1, I would just call it verse 1B or something, right? We're going to call this verse 2 for now. The addition of a new instrument. This guitar. Now again, how do we know the guitar is the focal point? Well, it's the only thing playing this sort of different melody. Everything else is just sort of this bed of sound for a melody to land on top of, right? So it's very obvious that that's the focal point. It's not much different than verse 1. If we kind of zoom out here and look at the arrangement, it's pretty similar to these 4 bars, but with the addition of that guitar. The counselor says Taetro got some sun on his ship. It's true. It also seems like levels are crucial for arrangement. I feel like most of my tracks fight for attention. It's partly mixing, and it's partly just making sure your tracks are not overly complicated. This is a very extreme example because it's a lo-fi beat, right? There's literally only one melody happening here. But as this track evolves, we'll get more into what's happening. Moving on, we're going to call this verse 2A. We added the element of a vocal sample. Now let's see how far we've come here. I mean, we're a minute 30 in, and I don't want to overanalyze, but I hope this is a helpful kind of analysis for how you look at your tracks. But we're not reinventing the wheel here. Verse 2 is built on the same foundation that verse 1 is built on. The pre-chorus is even built on a similar foundation. We just took some away. We just took some stuff away and changed some sounds. But by verse 2, we're giving our listeners something brand new to listen to, a new sound in this guitar sound, and then for the second half, a new sound in this little vocal sample. Now, this vocal sample is very sparse here in this section, but it becomes more of a clear element later on. So we're a little bit foreshadowing what's to come. Okay. And I know some of you are talking about how slow and kind of chill the track is. Some of you even call it sensual. But we're going to go on to a banger after this one, after we fully analyze this one. So now here we have this section at bar 29. You notice that the keyboard comes back up, the piano comes back up an octave. We lose kick again. So this is somewhere between a pre-chorus and a bridge, I would say. I'm gonna go ahead and call this whole section a bridge. It doesn't quite make a ton of sense in the traditional songwriting sense, but it's a little bit different than the pre-chorus because we've got this octave up piano. But again, I'm not saying I'm a lazy producer or anything, but this piano line has been the same throughout the whole track. Just been in different octaves. Okay, so we have this bridge section, which looks a lot like the pre-chorus section. We're reducing our drums. And as you can already tell by the arrangement view, we're gonna get less and less. We're gonna completely drop drums here. This vocal sample is sort of taking over. And what are we going to get at bar 37 here? I'm just going to call this our hook. This is like this big arrival point. It's a wall of sound. It's all these elements coming together in ways that they haven't before. It's a lot of the same musical ideas. The drums basically don't change. These drums are essentially the same thing that happens at verse 2, except some of these elements are extended longer and they're more dense. Now we have the combination of the vocal sample plus some additional guitar. And then once we get to bar 41, this is like hook A because we add even more elements to it. Hookah. Okay, so what did you notice? We brought back in this melody that we haven't heard since verse 1A. It would have been really easy to drop it at this arrival point at bar 37. However, what I'm thinking about is how do I constantly keep things interesting for the listener? Constantly, every 4 bars. And of course, that's subjective, whether or not you find this track interesting or not. But what we just came out of was a bridge section where the momentum was not forward. We were not building. This bridge actually reduces and reduces and reduces. We start with drums and shakers. And then eventually in the second half, we take that away completely. So it's a very dramatic arrival point once all the drums come back in here for that hook. And that's very satisfying for the listener. Not only that, but we're reintroducing bass and we're reintroducing the piano played at the lower octave, which gives us a much more full sound. So we come out of this sparse bridge that got less and less and less to boom, in your face, more and more and more, everything. So I'm giving the listener so much to listen to in this moment that gives me an opportunity to hold back this melody and not introduce it until the back half. One more note on melodies being a focal point, right? And how do you draw listeners' attention to a focal point of a track? That guitar that we've heard, I've actually got it on a different track. Not that one. This very simple guitar riff, right? That's very different than this guitar melody we heard earlier, right? It's the same sound though. This phrase that the guitar plays earlier is a melody. It's like meant to be called attention to. It's like a singer singing a melody line. This guitar later here in the hook is just a repeated riff. It exists as part of the foundation. It's not the thing that's on top, right? What that means is when it's time for the piano to come in, these two things can coexist. We recognize that the piano is sort of the top line melody there, and the guitar exists as a riff, as part of the foundation. They don't clash. However, if I took that piano melody and played it at the same time, actually, let's just go ahead and do it. If I took that piano melody and played it at the same time as that guitar melody, listen to how this will clash. Now they have some overlap in melody because it's the same track. There's some motifs there, but they're kind of just competing for attention when you play them together. Not all your musical ideas have to play at the same time. All right, let's finish out this track so we can get on to the next one and kind of switch up the mood. It's Friday. We want to gear up for the weekend. I want to give you some energy. So the next track has a lot more energy. Finally, we're at our outro. Now again, outro, something we kind of come up with. It's towards the end of the process, right? You're thinking about how do you make all these sounds fade away? How do we take things away? And this is pretty abrupt here, actually, at the outro. We go back to the higher octave piano. We let this melody finish out. Our field recording has come back in. And one little note here on the piano is even though it is the same musical idea, since it's the outro, I kind of played so that it would get slower and it's not locked to the grid. It starts being just perfectly in time. If I run the metronome, you'll hear. And then watch this chord here. You notice we're nowhere near being with the metronome at that point, but that's okay. Because the piano is basically the only thing that's happening in time, and we can have that little slowdown. We're in electronic music, we're in loop-based music. It's easy to get just always stuck on that grid and lose that kind of like human momentum thing, but we can apply that in this type of electronic music, of course. So an outro is a perfect time to do that, like a momentous kind of slowdown there at the end. And I think it makes for a better outro, right? We've reduced things. It's also about, again, how do you change sounds over time? If we take a look at the automation on this track, we notice that we're going to reduce highs over time, which is going to give the illusion that it's getting farther away because it's going to be less clear. And I believe, let me see what happens on these bells. Nice. Okay. Yeah, we see that same high cut is happening here on the bells as well. And then we have a dry, wet reverb, like kind of just inching up over time, giving the illusion that the sound's getting further and further away. So to recap that before we go on to the next track, and if there's any other questions on this track, do let me know in the chat. The reason I'm able to show this kind of finished track is because this track just came out this week. So if you search Daydream is the name of it, Daydream by Taetro on your streaming platform of choice, you can add it to your lo-fi chill playlists or just give it a listen. So not brain surgery here, right? We had our core loop, which I would identify as this. And we built on top of that. How do we make that different? Well, let's introduce a new instrument and play a different melody. Oh, guitar. Great. Perfect. How do we make anticipation, tension, and release? Well, let's make it more sparse and change the octave. Let's take things away. And then how do we make it triumphant and satisfying for the listener once we get to the end? A nice organic build, right? Wall of sound right there. Now, I did say I was going to mention these transitional sounds, which these sounds literally make the arrangement process and they make your arrangement so much more solid. You'll notice that pretty much at every point we've identified, everywhere there's a marker, almost, there has been some type of transitional sound, starting here with the intro. We've got this kind of white noise happening, leading us into verse 1. We even have a little bit of a transitional sound into verse 1A, the second half. And that sound is not so much of a noise, it's more of a tone, and that's actually taken from resampling of the vocal sample. Just kind of makes this nice, beautiful pad sound. And you see that the more dramatic of the change, right, the more dramatic of the transition sound. So verse 1A going to the pre-chorus, which is quite sparse, is getting this very big transition sound. Just perfectly leads right up and fades right out. And then the first time we do A downlifter, aka we've had risers, right? Sounds that build up to a point. Downlifter sounds that kind of fade down in our arrival. Think of a crash cymbal on a drum, or in a marching band, a crash cymbal, to emphasize that downbeat. The first time we have that is at the hook. And that's not by accident. That makes it much more obvious that it's an arrival point. It fades out. It's subtle, but it's there. And this will so much help. This just helps glue your sections together, having these little sounds. And what it does is it signals to the listener, oh, change is coming. So that when we get to a section like this pre-chorus, that basically has so much less than verse 1A has, the listener doesn't feel like, oh, you stole something from me, you took it away, I was really feeling that. The listener knows over time, as the sound is happening, that a change is about to come. So they're not dissatisfied when we get to this pre-chorus and we've taken something away. They understand that it's part of it's supposed to happen, right? And it also just helps build up tension and release, right? And that's why it works so well here in this hook. I guess this is the first time we used a downlifter there, and there's no drums at all. Great. So this is like a lo-fi track, right? But how does this all apply in a more traditional like pop electronic track? And we can definitely get into that. And I want to say hello. I hope I'm not missing too much in the Facebook chat. But hi, friends. It looks like you all are not having fun. You all are having fun, I should say. Tiny Bites, Arthur Rios, Michael G. Michael G says, I do not understand this music. Where are the robots in space exploration? Just music here today, you know? Good vibes. All right, this track's called Daydream by me, Taetro, Taetro. Go stream it on your favorite streaming platform. What do you say we amp things up, my friends? Let's do one more track that totally switches things up, but we can apply a lot of the same concepts for arrangement. Let's do it. And I can go even further into explaining some of those transitional sounds, but I think this track might get you pumped. So let's give it a listen. We are totally switching gears here. We're kicking it into high gear, I would say, with this track that we're about to listen to. I'm just going to up my buffer size in case the project is a little too intense. So we're not playing in real time. All right, ready to see this project? Here we go. So this track is sort of made with a vocalist in mind. It's a more, goes a little harder, I would say. Open with a guitar sample. We'll hear these drums hit. I'll let it kind of play into the, where the drums actually come in. It's a little bit louder than the previous track too. All right, and this track, the previous track, basically kind of built on the same musical ideas over and over. This track evolves a little bit more. All right, pause. Here we go. Loop this section. This is the core. This is the this is 4 bars. This is essentially the 4 bars that the track is built from, right? We all start with that 4-bar loop. And again, that's the first 16 bars of the track, very similar to the last track. How did we build up from there? You just take things away. It's very easy to build up your intro, right? So let's actually do the same thing we did with the previous one. Looks like we're working more of an 8-bar phrase here with the intro. That's kind of the first iteration of the intro. The next 4 bars we'll call intro A because we had some drums introduced. But again, not brain surgery here. It's a guitar sample followed by some percussion. And you will see in this group right here, which I'll make green. These are all my transitional sounds. you'll notice we aggressively transition into what would be a verse. Add locator, verse 1. And I'm going to breeze through this because this is very similar to the last track. Even though these are greatly different in terms of genre, it is very much a similar process here, right? We take that core idea and we spread it out. Take the guitar loop, start with just that. Give your listener piece by piece by piece if you can. Don't make it too frustrating. Build enough over time to keep it interesting, keep momentum. And keep feeding your listener more and more. Now listen to these drums for a moment. Just notice something. If you notice this drum pattern, which is in the intro, which is much more sparse and obviously doesn't have a kick or a snare, it's just this same exact loop, only utilizing the hat and the clap. Same exact thing. Not rebuilding the wheel here. Literally just taking these exact things and reducing them. Taking away rather than adding. Build up your core loop, then take away from it, and give your listener piece by piece by piece. Build on it, build on it, build on it. Kyle Gray Young says this is a FaceX track. It's not a FaceX track. Not yet, at least. But a new FaceX track did come out today. All right, and then obviously what happens, we add more and more. We add a vocal sample. We add some synths, which, let me open this up really quick. Yes, this is another pack from the ADSR store, from Ghost Project, like that, or like this. Yeah, K-pop inspired pack. Good serum presets in those packs for sure. What adds the most to this? What makes this the most different other than the new synths? Well, of course, it has to be the repeated hi-hat. That pushes us forward. More and more and more and more momentum. The next section, my friends, is where we completely diverge. Let's actually build up to it. We completely diverge. New musical content, basically. And let's give a listen to that and let's break it down a bit. Here we go, from the verse to the pre-chorus. Introduction of brass. Before we go on, I know you all really, really wanted to go on. If you did, that means this section did its job. If you felt dissatisfied by me stopping the song in that moment, that means this section is good. We call this is a proper pre-chorus because it's actually going to lead to a hook, an actual chorus. I'm using the term hook and chorus interchangeably if you get confused. This is an 8-bar section. Verse 1 is an 8-bar section as well. We just divide it into 2 because it's kind of like we added to it, And the same thing happens here with the pre-chorus. Okay, what happens here? We diverge from the original loop and we introduce a new sound. The main thing we introduce here is brass. Now, we don't just introduce the brass. We ease it in. Watch that filter automation. Sometimes, when you're introducing something new, it's better for your listener to sort of ease it in. The brass is quite the diversion from what we heard in verse 1A. Quite a new sound, right? Very synthy drum machine situation happening, and then suddenly we're going to introduce like heavy brass, which is a big like offshoot for the direction of the track. If we ease our listener into it, it becomes a little easier. Or there is something to say for smacking your listener in the face with something new. However, here I decided to filter in the brass. And it is kind of layered. And then the next thing we'll talk about here, 2 things to talk about for this section, my friends, and then we'll go on to that hook. This brass, you see that it's descending, right? We can see that pattern there pretty distinctly. That's pretty easy. And now we don't always have to introduce new sounds. We can use sounds that we've already used. So for instance, in verse 1A, we've got this synth here, which is kind of acting as a bass line. Well, here, we're actually going to use it to double that brass, and it's in a higher register than it was before. And it helps emphasize that descending brass line. And then we land on the hook. Now, this type of hook is something I've really been enjoying making. Because, just let it play out. I really enjoy making this type of hook because it's not necessarily sparse, but it's like hits, right? Bam. There's like that vocal sample happening, it's the brass hits, and the drums. Whereas the pre-chorus was like a lot of sounds happening. Which, by the way, something else we can't sleep on for our sections. Every other section for the drums, right? They just play a solid backbeat. Verse 1A, bar 25, where the hook starts. They're kind of like different feels, but they're steady backbeat. Bar 21, the second half of the pre-chorus, we're building up tension. We're leading up to a hook. So what would a drummer do? A drummer would be playing some type of fill. So we're diverging from doing a backbeat and doing more of a fill style. And then leading into a backbeat. And you hear how satisfying that is just listening to the drums, right? So programming little fills like this to build up tension and to build towards an arrival point is really, really important. And sometimes if you did start off with a core loop like I did, this verse 1A was basically the core loop that I started with. It's easy to just stay in backbeat land. But when it comes time to build a new section, and especially if it's a section like a pre-chorus where you want to build towards something, you got to introduce some new elements, you got to change the harmony, and you got to build up to it, doing rhythmic things like this and building up kind of tension in your instruments. But of course, the arrival point is satisfying because we just built up all that tension and landed on it. Let's just listen into it. Now, there's space for a vocalist on this. Don't forget that. It's not supposed to be just consumed as an instrumental. But do notice that the hook kind of has 2 sections. The really only difference between the 2 sections is the introduction of this synth here. Just a simple thing to add to the foundation. Again, you're going to see this happen in a lot of my productions. And you all see me do it every week as we build up beats, but pretty much every 4 bars, something is changing. Something is getting added, something is getting taken away. And that's no different for this hook when that synth comes in the second half. Because otherwise, if I take that away, it's just the same thing happening twice. Just kind of copy paste. So I just add 1 layer to it. And that feels natural. Every 4 bars, it feels natural. All right. And here we are back into a verse. That's fairly obvious, right? So the next 8 bars are going to be verse 2. But pay attention to that transition because this is very important for your arrangement. How do you get back? How do you get from this to this? How do we get back to that in a natural way? Well, this is actually, it's abrupt, but we also signal to the listener that it's coming, right? Again, that comes through with our transition sounds, right? We've got risers. I know something is happening. Not only that, but pay attention to the end of the phrase. I did talk about drums and backbeats and stuff, but this isn't just a normal loop where it plays the same thing for the 4 bars. This second half here, this 5th bar, is basically a drum fill. Let me go away. So basic drum backbeat, but this 4th bar of this phrase, just something simple like this clap line tells me that we're leading to something new. We're leading on to a new thing. And that repeats, right? It happens this time. It leads into what? Oh, a new synth happens. This time it leads into, oh, a new section is coming. And it's also backed by all those transitional FX sounds to let us know we're leading to something. Now, this transition into this verse section is a little bit unique because we don't just land on a backbeat. We actually go from quite a lot of sound to not a lot of sound. Oh, let me unsolo the drums. But what do we do there? We have a transitional sound, a riser. We also have a drum fill that leads into hitting at bar 34. All the while, our main guitar riff started, right? So the listener's like, oh, I've heard that before. I know where this is going. And then we're fully in verse mode. Zooming out here so you can see, here we are again. Pre-chorus 2. Not much different happening here. Actually, it might just be a complete copy-paste. And then we hit the hook. But it's not a complete copy-paste. One difference in the sections here is the choice to do that transition. Transitions have a lot to do with arrangement, right? Or else what ends up, if you don't properly work your transitions and signal to your listener that change is coming and build up tension and release, it just kind of sounds like parts glued together. And that's when I do the track review streams on my channel and when I hear like other people's music that are just starting out, you're mainly focusing on how do you make great musical ideas. And a lot of people get that down and they feel good in that, but then they don't take the next step, which is like, okay, now glue them all together. So this is a good example of adding change the second time around. And basically all it comes down to is if we look at these 2 beats, a bar 48, beat 3 and beat 4. Let me hone in on that. What you'll notice is everything cuts off. There's no sound. This is like, there's no sound there. There's 0 sound. All the instruments stop. Except for, all the instruments stop except for the drums. Which goes back to the idea of doing a drum fill, right? And that's just slightly different than the first pre-chorus where everything carries on. So I like doing that. Everything's a little bit different the second time around. So even though this pre-chorus is basically all the same musical ideas as this pre-chorus, what can you do to make a slight variation and a slight change? And here that was made evident by this little fill and dropping all those instruments out. What's up, Slash.com? Nice to see you. And then we have a hook Essentially the same thing. And we're gonna lead up to a bridge. Okay. Now this is where there's the most new, and this is like a proper bridge. That's why I wanted to show this project as opposed to the previous one. So if you're just tuning in, we dissected a much simpler track for arrangement, a more lo-fi chill track that has a little bit less going on. But this one is slightly more advanced in that we're adding new and more musical ideas. But, so basically what you'll notice is at this point here, we're introducing a bunch of new sounds. New synths. If I look at tracks 9, 10, and 11, these are synths that haven't been played previously. So I knew I wanted to build up a bridge section here, which actually goes to like here. Here. Wanted to build up a bridge. Introducing new sounds is a good way to transition your listener to something new. Of course, we kept one similar sound. We have this main bass sound, bass synth. That's familiar territory. But then here, we introduced the brass. A similar descending line. And that's sort of like this deceptive tension, right? Usually when we build like that, we hit hard. But this deceptive tension kind of is like, oh, what happened? But I'll show you kind of how this resolves, and then we'll talk about it. So listen back to this bridge section. We're going to hear that build and then just drop at bar 65. But then listen to how it comes back in. Familiar guitar loop. But where's the heavy? Let's bring the heavy back in. Abruptly. And this is the outro of the song. I'm going to let this play out and then talk about it. Fantastic. So this track ends differently than you've probably heard me end tracks before. There's no kind of fade out, nothing's fading away. It's just ending on a boom, a hit. But let's talk about that transition there. First of all, this group is my FX sounds. And if you remember from the last track, there were only a few sounds. For this, much more complex. Many more sounds here. It just looks, it's actually not that complex. It just, it's a lot more sounds. So just quickly pay attention to that. Remember, we're building up our sections, and you'll notice every time there's a marker, we're pretty much building up to it, or boom, there's like an arrival point, like a crash or something happening on it. Just constantly making these transition sounds. There's even one right here, right? Yep, that belongs in effects as well. Just take note of that. Like that's just happening. And this doesn't get done till way later, so forget about all that until you've actually got an arrangement plotted out, and then go ahead and throw in your transitional sounds. But this bridge, yeah, this bridge is a lot of fun because it's building. It's got like a building momentum, and then it drops that momentum. But how do we get back to a heavy hook? If we're gonna drop all that momentum, how do we get back? Well, we hit them hard. Now, in my opinion, without the FX riser leading to that moment, it's just like, what the heck is happening? Let's actually, for this section, take away all of these FX sounds. Why am I doing it this way? This is the worst way to do it. Let me just turn off the effects group, and let's listen to this section again. It's just gonna sound like, what the heck is going on? See how bad that sounds? Just one more time. It sounds way less intense, right? There's an effect sound somewhere in here. Or maybe it's like a filtered synth. I don't know what it is. Something. But yeah, and then you add in these transition sounds, completely transforms it. So imagine if you built up this cool thing, but you didn't have these sounds. It sounds so dead, right? The last thing here in this final hook. Again, we like to make things a little bit different. It's easy to just take the hook from before, copy, and paste it over. But especially if this is the final hook, we want this to be the most triumphant arrival point of the track. So what do? We don't really add any new musical content. However, if we remember, we have these brass hits. Bum, 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 bum. And we also have that here in the other hook too. That's nothing new. We have it at that hook. We have it at this hook. It's all the same. But what can we add? One more element for this final triumphant arrival point, and that is the addition of a synth. That's basically playing higher up the octave and just sounds that much more epic. Here it goes. Hear how much more life that adds? It was fine before. Like in the earlier iteration of the song, we hadn't heard this synth yet, so we couldn't miss it. But by the time we get to the end and we want to have built upon something and build something even greater, adding that synth higher octave on top to really hit home on those brass hits, you might not even really notice it your first time listening through, but you just feel like the ending is more epic for some reason. Bum, 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 bum. There's a whole riser happening all the way to the end here. What's up, Neil? Okay. This ending is another good example of hitting on the downbeat and not just stopping your loops at the end of a 4-bar thing. Because let's now imagine that I didn't do that last stinger at the end. Let's go ahead and mute the last stinger. Meaning that hit that comes in on beat 1 of bar 77. I'm just going to mute every sound that happens there and act as if I just copy and pasted the loops. Now, here it is without that stinger at the end. Watch how unsatisfying this is. It just leaves you hanging. So, I'm going to unmute those again. You need that hit. And that can't just be done by copy, paste, copy, paste. You kind of have to take the first sound, boom, and have it hit on the next downbeat, on that downbeat, the arrival point. There we are. Much better. Much more satisfying. And you can only see this you see this in a couple places here, actually. You'll see I have random clips just turned off. I actually don't even know what this is because this sound doesn't happen at all. Good example of something just muddying up the works, right? So I just take it away. I'm trying different ideas, but if it's muddy or taking things away, like you see clips deactivated here as well. If I reactivate that, I actually don't want a bass line there. It's actually a stronger pre-chorus, first half of the pre-chorus without that low bass line. So that's why that got taken away. So you can see a little bit of the process of stuff getting taken away. Taking that away as well. So I'm constantly making the assessment of how many musical ideas are too many musical ideas within an arrangement, and playing with the combinations of sounds, right? And I'm always kind of leading towards a final hook that combines most, if not all, of the sounds in interesting ways, and then adding one more epic element there at the end. But hopefully this is what can I say? A cohesive look at the arrangement process. and what goes on here. Again, just take a look at these transitional sounds. These are very, very crucial. I would say when you're arranging your track, mixing, of course, matters, but your orchestration matters as well. And I guess like that's the only real word I can think of it, and that comes from the classical world. But orchestration, meaning like what combination of instruments are you using? Is it vital to use that many instruments at the same time? Can you take some stuff away? Are things getting in the way of each other? Are certain sounds necessary, right? Because each one of the sounds playing here in this kind of initial loop has its own place, right? Nothing's clashing. This synth has the same quality as the guitar riff in the previous track. It's just kind of repeated. It adds to the bed of sound. The bass is slightly more melodic than usual, but it's not clashing with anything else because it's a bass line. The vocal sample, which is somewhere in here, it's playing on the offbeats, which nothing else really is. Everything else is landing kind of cleanly on the downbeats. So just like not a lot of things clashing, or then you have things playing in unison or synergizing, you know? So a lot of having successful arrangements is not overcomplicating things. Glue your sections together with effect sounds, transition sounds, signal to the listener that you're making a change. Don't reinvent the wheel. Take your initial idea and spread it out, build up, give your listener piece by piece by piece. And then eventually when you've built up a lot, take some stuff away, either drastically or just a couple pieces. Take some stuff away or build up an entirely new section. Take the instruments that you've already used during verse 1 or during your initial hook, and how can you build new musical material with them? Or maybe you get up to a point in your track like I did with this hook where you're like, okay, it's time to actually introduce some new instruments like I did with these synths. And again, it's not that complicated. They're all playing the same chord progression, right? Drum fills. Don't just play the same backbeat the whole song. A different feel for every section. And build up tension, create fills. That's what I got. And Michael G says cowbell, which is very important as well. Right, that was intense. I hope like that was a good balance of two different kinds of projects and two different approaches to the arrangement process. Hopefully that was clear. Of course, I usually approach my process from a contemporary like pop music standpoint because that's what I like listening to, and I really find that structure satisfying. But if you are really thinking about what kind of music you want to make and you have a lot of music that you really love listening to, I do encourage you to just sit down with a pad and paper, listen to your favorite song, and really try to mark out what happens at each section. Like distinctive features of each section, like, okay, this is an intro for the first 8 bars. Drums get introduced at bar 16 when the verse drops, like something like that. If you really start to analyze some of the songs you really like, you might see common things happening in the songs, and you might be able to replicate that for yourself. That's what I do. Whenever I'm making a song, I'm kind of going through the encyclopedia in my head of songs that I really like and deciding what can I take from that? What can I learn from that process? So this was fun. If you enjoyed this kind of production concept style stream, please let us know in a comment. If there are more production concepts you want us to tackle, specific concepts, let us know, because we're looking for topics for future Friday streams. I am here every Friday on the ADSR channel. Make sure you subscribe and turn notifications on. I'm also here every Wednesday doing the sample challenge. So if you are, or not the sample challenge, but the production challenge. So if you are not yet, join our Discord and you can become part of that production challenge. We give away prizes every week. It's a good time. I'm here on Wednesdays doing that. This is a lot of fun. The first track we listened to, called Daydream, it's on all streaming platforms. Look up Taetro, Daydream, Spotify, Apple Music, all that. Add it to your playlists. I've got my own channel, youtube.com/Taetro. You can find me on Instagram. Just look up Taetro on everything, Taetro, if you enjoyed this stream. But thank you all so much for tuning in. This was a really fun time. I can't wait to get into the next production concept next week. Let us know if this helps you in your arrangement process and if you're going to get to work this weekend arranging some of your tracks. But for now, that is going to be it. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been Taetro for ADSR. Have a good one.